Welcome to a new episode of Mind Your Mind, the podcast especially dedicated to everybody that works helping others in all kinds of helping professions, but also today we have a very, very special episode because it's the result of a collaboration between Roehampton University, the Wellbeing team in Roehampton University, and Mind Your Mind. And the reason why we're doing this is because we want to celebrate the Men's Mental Health Month. For that, I have the pleasure to be with two of my colleagues at the Wellbeing team. I am with Joe McCoy, he's a mental health advisor, and Colin Bailey, he's a student wellbeing officer at the Wellbeing team, apart from so many other things. No, these are the roles that they have in Roehampton. Yeah, we're here. Welcome. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah.
So we will be talking about men's mental health and celebrating the Men's Mental Health Month. We have a lot to talk about when we think about this. Why don't we kick with the very first sort of question, which is what are we talking about when we say mental health? That's the very basic. What are you talking when we talk about mental health?
When I think of mental health, I suppose what I think about is how you're feeling inside emotionally. What is, I suppose I've heard it described as an internal weather. So what you're feeling inside, and how it plays a huge role in how you're feeling, how you express yourself, how you manage a range of positive or negative emotions, how resilient you are to stress. Yeah, I suppose it's just a general kind of overall case of how you can react to certain challenges.
Yeah, I'm happy to add a bit to that. Thank you, Joe. I think just for a bit of additional context, I also deliver mental health first aid training on behalf of MHFA England, which I guess is a subsidiary of MHFA International. And I'd like to borrow the concept from that particular training, if that helps. And the suggestion is that, as Joe was suggesting, it's kind of an overall barometer of how we're feeling. The suggestion also through MHFA is that it's comprised of three main components in terms of our outlook, in terms of our future projections, and what we think about those in terms of whether they're optimistic or whether there's a bit of doom and gloom or foreboding as far as that's concerned. Then it's about our self-image. Let's call it in-look, because that sits quite comfortably alongside outlook. In terms of what we feel about ourselves, our self-worth, our self-value, our self-confidence, self-image. And again, that could be positive or negative. And then as Joe also alluded to there, it's how we cope with adverse life events, because life happens. But something that I've learned through my career and studying personal development and self-development is that it's maybe not necessarily what happens to you, but it's more about what you think about what happens to you, that the meaning that you associate with it, where possible, to have a choice. So again, that response to those life events would determine how resilient or how vulnerable we are. But I think it's also really important to encapsulate that we all have mental health. It's not that automatic mental ill health in terms of poor mental health or struggling. Just like physical health, we can be healthy, we can have a really positive emotional well-being as much as negative, whereas the general connotation is that mental health relates to the struggles or the challenges, with a massive generalization, the majority of people.
Yeah, so often associated with some kind of illness, with the struggle, with lack of resilience, and that's the thing, that sometimes we can be super resilient and we can be trotting along life feeling well, and something happens. Life happens, and then we don't feel good anymore. And then we need to go through a period of time in which we are somehow dealing with the situation, but also recovering from the impact of that situation. And I'm saying recovering, but also I will challenge that very word immediately, with what we are saying, because it's about acknowledging from what you're saying. I hear that you're saying this big umbrella. I like this idea of the idea of the internal weather, kind of, how are we feeling? How are we? Which is something that we are not used to ask ourselves, especially if we think about men.
Yeah, it's almost, I suppose, it's somewhat almost frowned upon, I suppose, through generations, isn't it, about men speaking about mental health? and about taking note of how they're doing. It's often coined or phrases like, or misconstrued as a sign of weakness to be fragile, or to be feeling stressed or emotional, or something's getting us down and we're not able to stand up or be resilient to whatever's affecting us.
Yeah, no, I agreed. I think there's a lot of maybe social expectation. Again, some phrases you mentioned, some misconceptions, but familiar phrases such as "man up," or I guess there's almost that expectation that men are assumed to be weak when in that moment of vulnerability, for example. And that could potentially be what I guess prevents men from reaching out and accessing that support in the first place. It's that fear of stigma or judgment, discrimination, or weakness, as you called it, Joe. I think
I've been called
you
worse.
bring joy into my life.
I've been called a lot worse in life. Don't worry.
Well, I think at the end of the day as well is also to I guess reflect a bit upon potentially intercultural and cross-cultural variations as well, and generational differences, each of which can bring within themselves increased challenges to be able to access that support and joy.
Yes.
Yeah. I suppose we were having lunch the other day, Roxanne, and we got talking about the generational aspects of mental health, and how we're not that far removed from a couple of generations ago, people going to war and coming back from war and seeing what they've seen and having no label and no assessment and no understanding of what was going on internally with their mental health. And then these people were doing their best they could to raise their children. But obviously through what they've experienced, I don't know, maybe come back to what Colin was saying about that suppression, manning up and getting on with it. That may have obviously flowed downhill into their parenting types, or kids wanted to impress parents and be strong and be tough like their dad is, and so on. And it kind of breeds this generation after generation of this is how we deal with it. I do think, though, I do hope, and I do have optimism that obviously with all of the current talk about mental health, and there's a lot more in the mainstream, I think this generation, I think what me and Colin see is, yes, we do see a lot of students with mental health issues, but we do see a lot of understanding about it, and they're coming for support, knowing that there's something internally misaligned and then they need support with. So I think we can take hope from that this generation seems to be turning the tide in their awareness of it.
Yes,
100%.
And the acceptance of vulnerability, I think, as well. No, the acceptance that you don't have to be always super strong, always, look like, even not showing tears, for example. No, that crying is okay, and so on. So, and that seems a very from what I'm saying, it is very deep, but also it comes through in simple examples, no? In these very simple little details that has to do with the way that we relate to others and how we can allow ourselves as well to express what we feel. And also, what is the expectation that we have on how that will be received? Because if you are in a group of friends sharing something that is delicate and it's just banter, for example, about it, then naturally you will withdraw, right? So I hear from what we're saying it comes to mind the notion of probably the men also need to find their places, find their people to feel safe enough to start to talk.
No, I guess, we are social animals. And again, that sense of connection is a really strong protective factor to kind of safeguard us or protect us against deteriorating or declining mental health, for example. But, again, as you said, it sounds really simple in terms of finding your tribe and feeling comfortable to share.
Yes.
But it's good to talk, but we also need to be in a position where that we're comfortable to speak and listen as far as that's concerned as well. And as Joe alluded to previously, the tide is turning. There are a lot more conversations taking place. I mean, I'm grateful from a Wellbeing at the university perspective that we are busy, because that shows that the message is getting through and that people are more comfortable and more confident to openly talk about what they might be experiencing. But that's also at the same time a simultaneous reflection on the environment that's created that welcomes those conversations. So it's kind of building
Exactly.
that bridge from both shores. Now, where someone is more comfortable to have those conversations, you mentioned banter. Language can be really, really harmful or detrimental, especially
Yes.
if it's negative language in terms of bringing down those shutters of support. But if we can start to normalize conversations, if we can start to encourage those open, honest, vulnerable, genuine, authentic conversations, people will hopefully be more comfortable to reach out for that support. But at the same time, also be more knowledgeable, more literate, more aware of what they may be experiencing, and therefore whether that support is available or where to access it. So that's definitely changed the landscape. Let's say, for example, over the last 10 years is dramatically different. And long may that continue.
Indeed. Do you think are there particular stats or particular characteristics to men's mental health?
Oh, you're the stat man.
Yeah, I was going to just give an opportunity rather than. I think there's a couple that really, really spring to mind for me. And I hope we're comfortable speaking openly about suicide as one of my missions to normalize the conversation. It is suggested that in terms of death by suicide, the ratio of deaths, and we're talking about gender in terms of the gender identified at, or associated at time of birth, that men are 3 times more likely. So the ratio is 75% male suicide to 25% female. There are also suggestions that women are more likely to, I guess, receive a diagnosis of mixed anxiety or depression. But my argument around that particular statistic is that suggestive of the concept that women are more likely to experience anxiety or depression? Or is that what we've spoken about in terms of the landscape and feeling comfortable to reach out for support? Because statistics can only reflect what's recorded. And if there's a resistance or a reluctance for a man, for example, to speak openly or to access therapy or a GP with vulnerability or mental health concerns, those statistics are not likely to be reflected as accurately, for example. There was a survey that was carried out by the Prince's Trust, which suggested that approximately 32% of young women felt depressed. And that was compared with about 19% of young men. So nearly a third of young women felt depressed, but about 1 in 5 young men. However, when we return back to those suicide statistics, 75% of deaths are male, 25% are female. And hopefully that's why we're having conversations, and that's why we have a month to promote men's mental health.
Yes,
Might I
absolutely.
suggest it should be mental health year, but I'll take a month over a day, any day of the week.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, no, that it's so many, well, the statistics and that level, no, are really scary and really sad, because that means that a lot of families are losing a male member of their family by suicide. The other element there is that the very fact that we have these stats is talking about a huge, probably long journey to get there, no?
Yeah.
And so many missed probably opportunities for those men to actually do something about what they need, no?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you see also, maybe this one is for Joe then, what are the challenges that men face in accessing services? What do you see around that?
I was looking up different barriers and things like that. Mind has done a 10-year catch-up survey just to check back in on men's mental health and see is there been any improvements. And there has been in terms of men accessing mental health supports, which is great. There is, and men not being as intimidated, let's say, to go and see their GP as previously examined. But some of the barriers that were identified in this survey within maybe not enough services, or maybe services that they weren't maybe not eligible for, but more so they couldn't access because of time of day, let's say, if it also had work commitments. Other barriers were some men still feel that if they were to they were avoiding a confirmation of getting a diagnosis of a particular mental health issue. So it's almost like ignorance is bliss. They'd rather not
Yes.
know that they had depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, whatever the mental health issue was. So it's this, again, go back to the stigma, isn't it? Really, it's about, I'd rather just not know if I had it or not, rather than taking control of the situation. Is what we're trying to do. We're trying to empower people to take more control over what they're currently going through. But if it's not acknowledged, or it's not, the help isn't sought, it's very hard to get control over something that you don't know what's happening. I think that was
And I think that there's a massive oversimplification in that, in terms of we can only address what we're aware of, to put it that simply. So, I guess, for some people, a diagnosis might be some kind of terminal prognosis or some kind of formalization that there's something wrong. Whereas for other people, as you've suggested, it unlocks the support in terms of identifying what that challenge might be, and then making my mum, for example, has Lewy body dementia, but without that diagnosis, would she have been able to access the therapy through counseling or psychotherapy, for example? Would she have had the medication to help to manage the signs and symptoms? So I guess that diagnosis can be the enabler, can be what facilitates that support. But for a lot of people, there is that fear, that stigma, that confirmation, for example, in my mum's words, that she was losing her mind. She didn't want that formalized. And it's far easier to kind of bury your head in the sand and hope it's going to go away than to kind of have that formalized and, I guess, force that acceptance upon you as well. So no, that stigma is massive, definitely.
Yes, it is definitely a big challenge in that level. Sometimes the diagnosis and the label that comes with it is a blessing, and other times it's like a curse, right? I think also, especially for those men that are listening this episode that are concerned about getting a diagnosis, I think also is the alternative to think about going into a place where you not necessarily need that label is fine. If you don't get that label, it's okay, but go beyond the label as well can be an opportunity. And
Yeah.
an opportunity, there is there an opportunity for change beyond the label. Joe, what about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we treat symptoms, not labels. I think
Yes.
that's our main focus really when it comes to people's mental health. So yeah, and I think as well that, again, I know this is the word of the day, isn't it? Stigma, but I think going back to someone that is labeled with anxiety or depression, and they're put on antidepressants or SSRIs, and it's like, okay, that's me for life then. That's not what medication is for. Medication can be very useful, and it can be very useful. Therapy can be very useful. Social therapists can be very useful. More of a structured routine is really, really useful. So I think it's getting away from this one-stop shop of people come in seeking mental health and they think, I'm going to be on medication now for the rest of my life. That's not the aim of the game. That's not what we try and do. We try and give the way I describe medication is it's a stepping stone. So think of your base level is I talk a lot with my hands in my sessions. So if we have a baseline, when we have depression, we go below that baseline of neutral. What we want is the medication to get us back to close to neutral, so then we can put the things in place that make us happy, give us joy, get us out being social. So it's exercise, family, eating correctly, whatever it may be. The medication helps us get close to that neutral level so we can put them things in place. Saying that's what medication reviews are for. So that's where your GP or psychiatrist or whoever's in charge of your treatment would review your medication every a couple of months, depends on what medication you're on, but let's say every 3, 6, 12 months. And they will reduce it if they feel like you're doing well, and they will test the waters. If you've put these things in place, can we then bring you off the medication? If not, if you're doing very well on it and you feel like it's agreeing with you as such, you'll stay on that maintenance dose. But I just want to reiterate that if you're put on medication, don't worry, it's not you for life. It's not your label for life. Depression is a transient thing. Anxiety is a transient thing. It doesn't have to be associated with you and your name as your label.
Absolutely. And also the other thing that I think is that self-understanding is so important in this whole process, because the way that I experience depression could be completely different from the way that you experience depression or anxiety and so on. And there is a lot to see about and understand about the context in which we are living and the way that we are dealing with life on a day-to-day. You talk about routines, for example, Joe, and that's so important as well. Colin, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to kind of echo what you've just shared there as well, in terms of no two people's experience of the same diagnosis will be the same. You know, I guess with depression, for example, in terms of the international classification of diseases, which is what we use here in England, it's 10 different signs and symptoms of depression. Not everyone is going to have the same combination or even same number, but then at the same time, the severity of those signs and symptoms, the duration of the experience will differ from one person to the next. And then you've also got our own, as you said, that how we internalize that, our own perception of that. And each of us will have our own mindset, what I guess Jackie and Aaron Skiff called the frame of reference, the window of the world. All of our past experiences kind of combine to almost create a prescription through which we view our reality.
Yeah.
Now, my prescription will be different to yours. And Mara suggests that if yourself or Joe or any of our listeners today would have put my glasses on, good luck seeing anything, to be totally honest. But, you know, there's going to be a different version of reality based on your own life experiences. It's kind of like, you know, watching a film with somebody else. You know, one of you might say, oh, wow, that was absolutely amazing. That mind blown, like Oscar nomination right there. And then the other one turns around and goes, yeah, okay, that was an hour and a half of my life I'll never get back. But hey, the popcorn was good. You know, it's the same experience. Everything's perfectly replicated. And that's not the case with mental illness. But even in those circumstances where everything is perfectly replicated, we come out of it with different perceptions of that. You know, and what impacts one person might be that proverbial water for ducks back to somebody else. We are unique. We are individual. And a quote that I throw out a lot, I throw out a lot of quotes. I'm not just the stat guy. But with the quotes, Eleanor Roosevelt once said that comparison is the thief of joy. And we have a tendency to compare ourselves with other people, but we're not comparing like for like.
Do you think that's the main thing? I mean, this is a massive generalization, and apologies for that. But if we are thinking about men's mental health in this very episode, I tend to think that there is a component there that is quite negative in anybody's mental health, really. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I think you're right. I suppose in terms of direct comparison, I wonder, is it more like a league? Like think of a Premiership league, like you're trying to like get status, you're trying to like go higher and higher. I think it's men's status or self-worth is based a lot around job, finances, and more so now, I suppose, even physical, in terms of looks, presentation, all that kind of stuff. So it is definitely creeping in a lot more into men's mental health. But I do think, I think there is a lot more comparison. I think social media has a lot to answer for with relation to comparison, and looking at all these influencers, which anyway, enough of that. So I think as I go back to Colin's comparison is the theft of joy. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And so and that's the word, no? The word of joy is something I want to pick up on in this very moment, because we hope and we aim to have joy, to be content. So there is something about allowing yourself and helping yourself to get used to connect with that, with joy, with safety, with what will bring an element of feeling okay, no? That internal sense of security that no matter what, there will be kind of solution to what we are dealing with. And so many times we cannot do that alone, no? And but somehow probably men, and we have socialized our children as well, sometimes to have to deal with things on their own, to suck it up and just deal with the situation in silence. And we don't learn to ask for help. First of all, to identify what we need and then ask for what we need. But also, if even our many experiences growing up, those moments that we have asked for help, the help didn't come, or the answer was like, just be a man and stop crying, then there is something there for us as parents as well, and for us as friends, to start to get used to, sharing a little bit more of what actually is worrying us. What do you think will be the ideal support system to maintain a healthy mental health?
I mean, I'm happy to kind of kick that one off. And I think it's really important to have that close and confiding relationship. I mean, we spoke about the benefits of therapy, and this podcast is brilliant in terms of continuing to advocate that and the opportunities and possibilities that are always present, even though we may not be aware of them at the time. And I think, there is always support available. Recovery is always likely and possible. But as you've suggested there, Roxana, it's far more likely where it's supported. Recovery doesn't happen in isolation. As I said before, we're social beings as well. So I think, we all have this innate desire to be accepted, to be included, to be valued. I guess it's one of the 5 ways to well-being, to be making a contribution, to be making a difference, to be doing something worthwhile. So if we feel recognized, if we feel seen, if we feel heard, that's a massive protective factor. We start to feel better about ourselves. And I can only speak from my own personal experience, but I guess I grew up in South Africa, and might I suggest the culture was slightly different there in terms of being able to speak openly about challenges, for example. But I think once we can normalize the conversations and you can find someone that's comfortable to accept those conversations, and you feel that actually I can be open, I can be honest, I can be authentic and genuine without fear of judgment. In other words, that tolerance and acceptance, I'm less likely to have a lower sense of self-esteem. Whereas if I feel judged, if I feel isolated, if I feel that I'm not part of the crowd, that's going to build that sense of maybe social withdrawal or avoidance, and you'll disconnect from that connection. So therapy is amazing. It doesn't have to be professional. It can be informal in terms of a loved one, a friend, a partner, for example. And if you can find someone who's comfortable to see your inner vulnerabilities and still love you through that, then that's one of the greatest gifts, to be fair. But you can only really accept that if you're willing to be vulnerable. And I think something else that's kind of maybe embedded within us is that expectation that, we're kind of want to be liked by everybody. So we're seeking external validation. Maybe, again, massive generalization. Joe was mentioning about social media's got a lot to answer for, but we kind of live our lives by how many likes we get, how many interactions, how many posts, how often things are shared in terms of regularity or frequency or volume. Whereas actually we don't need thousands of friends that we don't even know who they are. One close friend can be enough. It's more about that quantity being less important than the quality of those connections. So actually, where we're looking for that external validation, we're kind of looking in the wrong place, because only one person can truly make you happy, and that's yourself. It comes from within. And that might be lived experience. It might be learning from experience. And as Nelson Mandela said, I never lose. I either win or I learn. How do I appreciate? How do I embed the lessons I've had in life to ensure that they're not repeated, for example? And if I can truly love myself, then that's the foundation upon which happiness exists. Sonia Lyubomirsky did a lot of work around positive psychology. Sonia Lyubomirsky, and these figures are approximate, suggests that approximately 40% of our happiness is determined by intentional activity. Don't get me wrong, there's 60% that's not. And we look at the biopsychosocial model. It's biology, it's chemistry, it's learned behavior, nature and nurture. It's also the environment in which we find ourselves. It's the circumstances that we experience. but then there are also choices we can make, and they can be something simple like diet, nutrition, exercise, sleep, lifestyle choices. But put the three together, and that's the recipe for success.
Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, all excellent points. Absolutely. I think going back to some of the stuff Colin said is feeling a sense of purpose and feeling valued. Taking a more insular kind of look rather than the big picture about everything that's like that I don't have control of. What do I have control of? What can I contribute to? And again, go back, echo what Colin said about being part of like your immediate social circle, your friends, your family, your job, maybe sports teams, whatever that may be. And I think again, go back to something else I said. It's like a parrot here, repeating myself, but like setting goals, no matter how trivial they may seem to you, because you need to feel like you are achieving something, like getting forward. That's where we take that self-confidence from, and we feel like hopefully we can start into a snowball effect, but it has to start somewhere. So we don't want to be looking at the top of this mountain that seems impossible to climb. So it's all about starting much closer to home, and just trying to improve on little bits each day. It's not going to be changed overnight, but it's definitely a good journey to go on to at least start.
And I think from a coaching perspective, that concept of goals is massively important. Having something to work towards, not only in terms of that positive outlook, in terms of one of those contributors towards that overall barometer of how we're feeling. But as you've alluded to there, a lot of people tend to get overwhelmed because they look at the distance between where we are and where we think we should be. Whereas actually something that resonates really well with me, and maybe that's because of my South African origins, but when I was studying to become a coach, my mentor said to me, how do you eat an elephant? Now, don't get me wrong, I've never tried, but it's one bite at a time. Lao Tzu said the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But I also had the honor and privilege of working with Bob Proctor. And Bob said to me, it's the start that stops most people. So if we can chunk it down, if we can break it down into those individual steps, you're far more likely to take that initial step. And then you can always increase the momentum from there. So that first step is crucial. And I guess, the more achievable it seems, the more likely that person is to take that step, for example. But I think it's also really, really important, as you've said, to celebrate the success, to kind of recognize that. And we don't have to wait till we cross the finish line. It's kind of celebrate the small wins as well, because your mind kind of gets a bit of a kick from that. And I guess, the more we kind of get that pleasure receptor activated, the more we're encouraged to do more of it. So those small little victories can actually add up to those monumental successes as well.
And as a consequence, also add positively to your own mental health, to your general well-being of the way that you feel about yourself and so on. And this is another massive generalization, but from my understanding, I'm imagining that it's easy for anybody, but thinking about men and all the men that are hearing us today is the idea of, it's probably very easy to set up those goals, no? And probably is the way that men tend to function a lot, women as well, but it's something about that constant looking forward, and that looking forward sometimes is a massive big thing. And what about those little steps and the celebration of those little steps, and identifying what do you need as well for those to do that very little step that is the minimum easiest possible, and that support system is sometimes necessary actually to have that one first step, no? And thinking that we shall not expect to do everything alone, to find all the solutions alone, and so on. I remember,
and I think that's a great point. Can I just jump in really quickly? And apologies for interrupting, but Bob Proctor once shared what I think is quite a profound lesson with me, and it's something that kind of drives my support of everyone I support, whether it's the university or beyond. And Bob kind of shared that it's your journey, it's your lesson. You need to learn it. We can't walk it for you. You need to walk it. And actually, when we give somebody the answers, we're giving them from our frame of reference, from our lenses. And what works for me, as we've suggested, one person's experience of poor mental health might be totally different to somebody else's. If I'm telling you what works for me, there's no guarantee it's going to work for you. So really important to kind of get that understanding of how would you like to be supported? What does that look like for you? What's
Exactly.
your objective? But to continue that kind of philosophy, you know, we can't do it for you. You need to do it yourself. There's a very important second aspect to that philosophy, and that is, although you need to do it yourself, you don't need to do it alone.
Exactly.
We can do it with you, but we can't do it for you. And actually, that's what we all do with Wellbeing. We support people on their journeys rather than take that journey or take that burden or take that responsibility from them, which in itself is disempowering, and you've not got the opportunity to learn from that experience.
Yes, and to walk the walk with company in a way, especially if it is slightly difficult, then the company can make it easy. I was just about to share this very moment that I realized when I was about to start the podcast, and the very first podcast I did a couple of years ago now. I came across this idea of actually that the very difficult part is to do sometimes that very first step, because one thing, and I personally was in that place of wanting it to be good, perfect, and so on, no? And you don't do it until you actually do it, and then I just allow myself to go ahead and do the first episode as however it was, and then carry on from there and carry on building from there. And it's amazing the amount of connections and the fact that we are also having this collaboration today, doing it together is fantastic. And this becomes a journey, no? That is different for everybody.
We wouldn't be having this conversation now if you hadn't put that first one out there.
Exactly.
You know, you've got to have the first step to have the second, the third, the fourth.
Absolutely.
And Brendan Bashard, I had the pleasure of working with in San Diego in 2017. Brendan shared that I guess, you know, it's really important that you can't perfect something that doesn't already exist. You can't tweak it if it's not already there. Get it, put it out there. You know, 7 out of 10 is the new perfect. Launch it. Once it's out, you can then start to tweak it and improve. And psychologists also talk about a confidence competence loop. The more you do something, the better you get, the more competent you become. The more competent, the better you are, the more confident you become. And that then just totally snowballs. So from a similar perspective,
yeah, so
I've got a YouTube channel and my first video is awful, but they get better, but they couldn't get better if I hadn't done the first. So yeah.
Absolutely. And there it is something about related to my next question, Joe, that is more thinking about, well, we are going into this place of action, right? And we are reaching as well the end of this episode. And normally when we get to this point, we start to think about what can be done, because we also, want to talk about the actions that are useful for creating change, no? And we are already starting to talk about that. But I think there is something about practicing those conversations that we are talking about, no? Those conversations that allow us to reach out for support. What do you see it could be the first step to initiate those conversations that are to request that support?
Yeah. I just go back to your previous point of starting the podcast. I think that's very relative when it comes to men, obviously specifically, seen as this podcast is aimed at men. It's practical things. I think men are much better at practical solutions. We want practical things to do, to take part in. I think women are far better at talking about emotions and what's bothering them and how to react to things. I've often come home from going to the pub with the lads to watch rugby and come home and she'll ask me, what you talk about? I was like, I have no idea. I don't actually know. Been out for the last couple of hours. I actually couldn't tell you a single conversation we had. So I could tell her the score of the rugby match. I probably couldn't tell her of what we actually talked about. So I think practical things are very, very important for guys to do. So just to make sure I kind of got that out of my head. So the open conversations, it all can be awkward, especially if you've never done it before. After me and Colin do it every single day. We talk about mental health every single day. So it's quite normal. And even with my own mates, I'll have no problem asking like how they're doing or if anything's wrong, and they seem to be quite open, which is great. But if you're a person who, let's say, finds it very uncomfortable, you don't have to have the perfect conversation ready. You don't have to know all the terminology and have it like succinct so you can get your point across. You can literally say to someone, I'm feeling a bit off today. I don't feel like myself. My thoughts are racing. I'm feeling a little bit low. I'm feeling agitated. There's so many ways to open this conversation. You don't have to directly talk about my mental health is poor. It can be a symptom. Describe a symptom you're having. I just feel a bit off. I can't think straight. Anything like that, just to get that across. Because what that does is that opens the conversation up, because you might not have the terminology, but having the conversation gives you a sounding board. So whoever you're talking to, you can listen back to what you're saying. They can give you a bit more insight into maybe something that they've experienced, or maybe they might have a bit more knowledge about mental health, or if that's with a GP or a therapist. The conversation will clear up the terminology that you want to use and get you more of that specific topic that you feel that you want to hit on. So just use your own words to describe what you're feeling and let the conversation take its course.
Yeah, and I was reading an article in the VACP magazine this month, and there are lots of organizations thinking about men's health, and they were also mentioning, different programs that are around the UK, thinking about how these conversations can happen sometimes with your barber or with your hairdresser or in your sports club. It's like it doesn't need to start at your GP, although it could, if you want to, because it's a private conversation and confidential conversation. But it can start just with your group of people, whoever you have close, and I like that of just use your own words. And to get started with those supportive conversations. What is your idea of a starting point, Colin?
Mine's very similar to Joe's. I can only echo the importance of a natural, calm, and confident conversation. And if you're using your own language, if it's vocabulary that you normally use, it's not going to feel different. If it feels different, it feels awkward, it feels uncomfortable, and it then becomes an uncomfortable conversation. So again, just to echo exactly what Joe said, it's about having the intention to want to support something. It doesn't matter about having the right, literacy or vocabulary. Use language you would normally use. The more we can normalize the conversation, the more natural that conversation appears and feels, the greater that connection. And as Brené Brown says when she's talking about empathy, rarely can a response have the desired effect. What brings about the result is that sense of connection. So that conversation, that empathy, that feeling comfortable, feeling calm, feeling confident. Because if we're calm and confident, that kind of becomes contagious, and it spreads into the person we're supporting, and they then feel more comfortable, and it feels like a natural conversation, and that's where it starts to flow. And I think at the end of the day, Carol?
Yeah, and I was saying the other way around as well. Sometimes you may need that one of your friends is kind of off. Something is going on for them because you know them. You may notice that something is going on, but you also don't know how to approach the conversation. And I think just be a friend.
Definitely.
Just use your regular words, and that you don't need to have any speciality or any degree or to be a specialist on mental health. Just use your own words to ask your mate, hey, how are you today? What's going on? I have noticed something. Is something going on? And that probably can lead and let the conversation to follow their course, as you say. It's about that connection and that sensation and that recognition that actually you don't have to suffer alone. We are reaching the end of the episode. So last thoughts, anything that you would like to add? And for anybody that is listening, for all our men out there listening today, Colin, do you want to add one thing?
Yeah, one bit of advice, if I could. It's something that Roman Kemp shared in the documentary that was on BBC a couple of years ago. And Roman was talking about the 2 OK rule. As Joe mentioned it before, most men, again, it's a massive generalization, and apologies for that. But when you ask someone how they're feeling, it's like, I'm okay. But if you're not convinced that they are okay, if you do have a gut feeling, ask again. No, genuinely, are you okay? And I guess if I have literally 30 seconds, it reminds me of an advert that was in Australian TV about the "You okay, mate," which is essentially encouraging men to speak to each other. And as you suggested, Roxana, we can identify when something's not right with our mates. Let's just ask them, "Are you okay, mate? You all right, mate?" But the advert was about two lumberjacks chopping down trees, and as one fell, it pinned the other one to the ground, and he's lying there pinned by this massive trunk, and he walks over to him and goes, "You all right, mate?" He goes, "I'm fine." And that's our response. We say that we're fine, but if in doubt, ask again. It's the 2 OK rule. Just check in on a mate. If you have a genuine concern, there's a reason for that. That might not be themselves. As your mate, you'll be able to pick up that change in their behavior or their appearance. It'll be a change to their normal baseline, I think you called it, Joe, behavior. If you're in doubt, there's no harm in checking in and just asking the question.
Definitely.
No problem at all. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I suppose from the individual who's listening to this, who is maybe noticing something about their own mental health that may be slightly off, just take a minute, just have a think about what the last week or two has been like. How's your thoughts? How are you feeling? Are you low on energy? Have you no enjoyment? You get quite apathetic about things. Losing interest in hobbies, not wanting to talk to friends, isolating yourself, maybe drinking more than usual. Just have a think about how you feel internally. Again, back to the first thing we talked about, internal weather system. Go back to that and see how things are. And if you do notice something's off, go and open up if you can, if you've got a close friend, if you can say, "I'm just not feeling great at the minute," and let the conversations flow from there. In that time as well, can you book a GP appointment? GPs are, I must say, we're quite lucky, obviously, in Roehampton. We've got some excellent GPs who are very, very well versed in mental health. Unfortunately, not every GP is, but it does seem to be getting better, luckily.
Yeah.
And if the GP isn't versed in mental health, they do have referral pathways where they can pass you on to mental health. We've got loads of charities as well for mental health, which we can probably put at the end of this podcast and get in, Roxana.
Yes, we will be sharing all the links in the description of this episode.
Yeah.
You will find all the links with all the organizations that the article that I mentioned around the VACP, the British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy, has shared this month. And we will also include the links for the Wellbeing services within Roehampton University. And anything else that you both will be sharing with me. So
Absolutely.
have a look to the description of this podcast, because you will find lots of resources there too.
Can I just share one last thing? Sorry. And I appreciate it for time. But what I would suggest, we've spoken again, Joe, you said it was the word of the day in terms of stigma. If you're worried about reaching out to somebody, or you've got that resistance or reluctance, and you're concerned that, it's not private or anonymous or confidential, there are helplines like Shout or Samaritans where you are treated in confidence and it is in pure anonymity. 111 in terms of the NHS number now also has mental health support. So I guess, it doesn't have to be that formal approach if you're worried about that judgment. If you would rather speak out to someone it's normally always in confidence unless there's risk. But if you'd like to speak to someone anonymously, then there are organizations to support you with that too.
Yes, absolutely. And that can help as well, no? Yeah. So what is left for us is to invite everybody just to share this episode. If you find anything in all what we have been talking about that is particularly useful for you, or you think about a friend, one of your mates that are out there, and they may feel there is something useful in this episode for them, or in the description or anywhere, please do share it and help us to help. And I want to give you a massive thank you, Colin and Joe. It's great to have this conversation with you two. I'm amazed that we have been able to do this. I've never thought that I will be able to be doing an episode with two of my colleagues. So thank you so much. A big shout to the Wellbeing team as well in Roehampton University, to all our hardworking colleagues that are out there supporting so many students every day. So thank you both for being here with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, and thank you for all that you do to us and everyone beyond. So thanks for listening.